Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Future of Scientific Conferencing Workshop in the track focused on environmental sustainability of scientific conferences and meetings. My name is Takara Chamberlain, and I'm a health specialist in the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences at the NIH. I am also a member of the Future of Scientific Conferencing Workshop Planning Committee. In this, oh, sorry about that. I will be moderating this session focused on redefining conferences, innovative formats for sustainable engagement. In this session, we will hear a brief presentation from each of our speakers. After all the presentations, we will engage in a group moderated discussion, including questions that are submitted by the audience. At any time in the session, you may use the Q&A function to submit your questions for the speakers. You may also use the chat function to share your thoughts and engage in discussion. I am pleased to introduce the speakers in this session. For additional information about each of our speakers, you can access the speaker biography and headshots located here in the Labroots platform. Our first speaker will be Yanqiu Tao, doctoral candidate in systems engineering at Cornell University. Nils Meyer-Kahlen, doctoral candidate in the Department of Information and Communications Engineering at Aalto University. And Dr. Cassandra Raby, teaching fellow at the School of Biology at the University of Leeds. Now, let's begin with the first presentation by Yanqiu Tao. Thank you.
Thank you for your introduction. So, hi everyone, this is Yanqiu, and I'm going to present on the title of Trend Towards Virtual and Hybrid Conferences May be an Effective Climate Change Mitigation Strategy today. So first, the COVID-19 pandemic has created challenges for people and organizations around the world. Like video conferencing have suddenly become pervasive in our lives. So it's no surprise that 3 of the top 7 fastest growing apps during the pandemic are video conferencing tools. Video conferencing is expected to produce lower GHG emissions by avoiding transportations. A previous study estimated the total travel emissions for over 1,000 participants as around 1,900 ton carbon dioxide equivalent. This is of the same order of magnitude as the annual emissions of a medium-sized research institute such as the Max Planck Institute. The average carbon footprint per capita is 1.5 ton carbon dioxide equivalent and is comparable to the annual emissions per capita of some developing countries such as India. There are 2 goals for this study. The first one is to compare the environmental sustainability of virtual versus in-person conferences with multiple hubs. Hub selections and participant assignments are optimized using a facility location model to assess the carbon footprint mitigation potential. Furthermore, we consider 2 sets of the scenarios for the hybrid conferences to investigate the trade-offs between in-person communication and carbon footprint. We use the data from 2020 ACLC virtual conference to present the case study. To achieve the goals just mentioned, we integrate the life cycle assessment approach and the spatial analysis. The system boundary of an in-person conference involves food, accommodation, preparation, execution, and transportation. For ground transportation, we calculate route distance, and for air transportation, we calculate the great circle distance. Considering the time consumed on trips, when the travel distance for one-way trip of a participant is more than 650 kilometer by rail in the Europe and 500 kilometer by car in areas outside the Europe. Air transportation is selected as the main transportation mode between the assigned conference hub and the nearest airport to the participant's origin. For food preparation, food consumption and utilities are considered. The accommodation stage only considers utilities, including water, electricity, and thermal energy, and also the waste treatment for staying at a hotel or guest home. The preparation stage involves preparation activities associated with conference committee's website, print materials, and souvenirs. For the execution stage, utilities and waste treatment of the conference venue are considered. Um, food sorry, food, accommodation, and preparation are also included in the system boundary of the virtual conference, while transportation are eliminated. The unique stage of virtual conference is information and communication technology, abbreviated as ICT. We define one average participant as a functional unit, and we consider the carbon footprint, cumulative energy demand, and the 17 recipe midpoint indicators as life cycle impact assessment methods. To investigate the impacts of conference hubs, hub selection, and the participant assignment on the environmental sustainability, a combination of spatial analysis and the facility location optimization is employed. Six scenarios with 1 to 6 conference hubs are considered. The objective is to minimize the total transportation distances of all participants. Each participant must be assigned to one of the alternative locations as shown by this constraint. And these two constraints determine whether an alternative location is selected as one of the conference hubs, and beta equals to 20 and represents a threshold of no less than 20 participants in each hub. The last constraint represents the number of conference hubs, which defined by settings of different in-person scenarios. Sorry. Conferences are usually held in places that can suit the need of participants, such as good accessibility, less stops for the round trip, and a cheaper flight tickets. To best accommodate these needs, we selected the world top 30 busiest airport by passenger traffic as alternative locations for the conference hubs. And since 77% of the participants for the ACLC conference are from the US. More than one alternative location in the US is expected to be chosen for scenarios allowing multiple hubs. For these scenarios, we selected the world top 30 and the US top 15 busiest airports as alternative locations for the conference hubs. This map shows the transportation routes for participants of the One Hub in-person conference. The optimal hub is Chicago, and owing to the landing and takeoff circle emissions of flights, environmental impacts of air transportation scale with distance through a polynomial function, with greater distance tending to have lower unit environmental impacts. Through calculation for a single passenger, the carbon footprint of driving is equivalent to that of air transportation when the travel distance is around 500 kilometers. Therefore, the unit carbon footprint for trips primarily by plane tends to be smaller than that for driving. The trips primarily by planes embrace not only air transportation but also ground transportation. The carbon footprint increases with longer driving distances and choice of rail as ground transportation shift the carbon footprint downwards, as shown in this figure. Uh, Among the GHG emissions of 280 ton carbon dioxide equivalent for all participants' trips, 50% of which is resulted from long distance travel with a round trip distance of it should be over 5,000 kilometers. The results show that transitioning from in-person to virtual conferencing reduces the carbon footprint by 94% and the cumulative energy demand by 90%, primarily due to the avoidance of air and car transportation for uh, participants. The environmental impacts of Okay, so the environmental impacts of air transportation involve aircraft production, airport construction, fuel production, and the exhaust emissions from aircraft operation. In particular, air transportation dominates carbon footprint through exhaust emission of carbon dioxide during the entire flight, as well as aviation-induced cloudiness during the CCD phase. Moreover, the fuel production results in the dominance of air transportation in CED, ozone depletion, natural land transportation, and fossil depletion. Uh, direct direct nitrogen oxide emissions. I think there's something wrong with the animation. Sorry. So direct nitrogen oxide emissions during the entire flight contributes to the majority of the marine purification. For the photochemical oxidant formation, aircraft construction, fuel production, and landing and takeoff face emissions of unburned hydrocarbons and nitrogen oxide are the leading contributors. So, among other impact categories, fresh water and marine ecotoxicity, metal depletion, and terrestrial acidifications are dominated by car transportation. Uh, this is primarily related to infrastructure and the maintenance of the vehicle and fuel consumption. Moreover, agriculture, land occupation, terrestrial ecotoxicity, and the water depletion are dominated by food preparation for both in-person and the virtual conference. Among other impact categories, so we also compare the environmental impacts across the in-person scenarios. The results suggest that adding conference hubs can reduce the carbon emission and the cumulative energy demand of the in-person conference by half, and the environmental impacts of several impact categories are susceptible to the spatial variation of electricity production by energy sources and technologies. Hence, the choice of hub locations is critical to this midpoint indicators. Adding more hubs leads to reductions in the air transportation distances. Therefore, impact categories led by air transportation achieve the most reduction benefits from the addition of conference hubs. However, the changes in the ground transportation distance across these in-person scenarios are subtle. Specifically, as the total number of hub grows, the driving distances increase since more participants switch from air transportation to driving. However, the addition of conference hubs also induces the reassignments of participants to a closer hub, which subsequently reduces the driving distances. When the number of hubs continues to grow, less modal switching and participants' reassignments occur, and therefore the driving distances become steady. Due to the greatest driving distances, the six-hub in-person scenario has the highest impact, environmental impacts among all in-person scenarios in some impact categories that are all contributed significantly by car transportation. And this is an in-person conference with two hubs, where one is in the Frankfurt and the other is Chicago. And as 9% of participants are from Europe and the Middle East, a European hub is selected for cases with more than one hub. And at the same time, most participants are from North America, so especially the US. So the cases adding more conference hubs leading to selection of more US hubs. For the three-hub scenario, the selected hubs are Frankfurt, Newark, and Denver. For the four-hub scenario, and five. So this is a five hub scenario. Like more hubs in the US are selected. We investigate the trade-offs between in-person interactions and the carbon footprint of hybrid conferences. Two sets of hybrid scenarios are considered based on their specific constraints. The first is to specify the maximum virtual participation level at 10%, 30%, 50%, or 70% by adding one more constraint. Also, the equality in the second constraint is replaced with an inequality, representing not all participants are necessarily assigned to a conference hub. So, I think it's not possible for me to change the slide. Okay. So the other is to set the maximum one-way travel distance at 1,000, 3,000, 5,000, and 10,000 kilometers while maximizing participation by replacing values exceeding the distance threshold in the distance matrix. So the addition, I'll wrapping up the results quickly. So the addition of more hubs for hybrid conferences results in a reduction of transportation distances and consequently a lower carbon footprint. As shown in the result figure, raising the virtual participation level to 50% can cut the carbon footprint of pure in-person conferences by 2/3 for all scenarios with the same number of hubs. And for multi-hub scenarios, raising the virtual participation level to 70% eliminates air travel and resulting in an over 80% reduction in the carbon footprint. But the scenarios with maximum travel distance doesn't show very good effects in mitigating carbon footprint for the in-person conferences. So yeah, so that is the end of my presentation, and there's a there's a conclusion slide in the end, and I'm not sure whether the audience can see it. So thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Yanqiu. All right, our next presenter is Nils Meyer-Kahlen.
Hi. Hello. I hope you can hear me and see my title slide. So this was really great because you talked about these multi-hub events, and we actually organized one of those a couple of years ago. So I hope that I can contribute some practical insights and some evaluation from this event here. Now, I am Nils Meyer-Kahlen. I have a position as a postdoc here in Finland at Aalto University, and my field is acoustics, so not climate science or anything related. And I actually recently submitted my PhD thesis, and then there's my co-author, Richard Parncut, who was a professor of systematic musicology in Graz, and he recently published a new book about major-minor tonality. And right now, he is on a lecture tour presenting about the book and also about more environmentally sustainable conferences, going from Austria to Australia without flying. And he would have really liked to talk about this himself because he was the chair of the conference that I will explain. But he was afraid that he might be in the Caspian Sea somewhere without Wi-Fi. So he asked me to do this instead, which I'm very glad to do. So before I get to the event and some details about it and some evaluation that we did, I wanted to motivate these kind of multi-hub events a little bit. And I had some assumptions here on this slide, but last week when I prepared this, I thought that maybe it's good to support those a little bit empirically. So I did a very small survey with my colleagues in the lab to whom I sent this, and I asked them a couple of questions. And one of them was, what are your personal goals when you attend a conference? And many of them said that the content is important. So you should see what other people are doing, studies they're conducting. But also many mentioned that they go to a conference to get inspiration and new research ideas. But everybody said that it's about social interaction. So you should go there to meet new and old colleagues. And some also said that to go to a conference is also about having fun and visiting nice and interesting places. And this is something that I have been observing the last couple of years when I look at my email inbox, especially the junk folder. Then I see many proposals. You should go to this serious or not so serious event here or there. And I just picked one of them and went on the website, where if you go to the website, you see this mathy thing. I have no idea what the conference is about, probably something engineering related. But then if you wait for a few seconds, you see this wonderful beach in the Maldives, which they use to advertise their event. So this is a practice that I want to point your attention to, which I think is interesting. So, but this is all nice and good. So the question is, who benefits from these kind of events? And the obvious answer is that everyone who can afford it. And who loses? Okay, everyone who cannot afford it. And then the elephant in the room, everyone else on the planet, which we've heard quite a lot already about the costs of the environmental costs of traveling to conferences. So I don't have to talk about that much more. So here, these were some numbers we got at the time when looking into the fact how much aviation contributes to global warming. But here's one graph that I wouldn't need to show you, but I wanted to because this was really the one in recent years that really stood out to me, and that's the one I've been also showing to others when talking about this. So you see historical CO2 emission data. Then people who made this in 2019 said that, okay, let's assume that these emissions are staying roughly constant. In reality, there was the little COVID dip. But then they calculated, okay, which paths, emission paths would we have to take not to exceed a given limit and of global warming. And it's not really about the numbers, but the point you see here is that we need to cut emissions very quickly, and we have to go to near zero. And for me, this has been really the big point, that if within the next couple of decades we want to reach near zero or net zero emissions, then that means everything counts. So that's the end of whataboutism, where you say that, okay, you may save a little bit of emissions here, but then you emit them elsewhere. No, if we want to go to zero, then everything should be considered. And the trade-off we are making here is really between avoiding climate catastrophes like the ones you're seeing right now everywhere in the world, and having a functioning academia, which is also a legit goal, so that people can have meaningful careers that they like, and we can advance human knowledge. And that's what we have to, it's a difficult question that we have to negotiate somehow. But okay, how do we do this? How do we manage to kind of make this trade-off? And one of the solutions is to find formats that are more sustainable and at the same time maybe more inclusive. And when I asked my colleagues, and the first idea is okay to do virtual conferences. And when I asked my colleagues about the ones they had attended and which of their goals were fulfilled when they did so, then many of them said that, yeah, the content you could probably get, although it's a little bit hard to concentrate, but inspiration and social interaction you don't really get from purely virtual events like the one we're having. And some even said that none of their goals could be fulfilled by a virtual event. So if we summarize this very roughly, so in a conventional event, you have a lot of social contact, face-to-face contact, which you don't have in a virtual event, whereas virtual events have much lower emissions and much higher inclusivity because the costs are much lower and everyone can join. But what we have been asking ourselves is that what could be an alternative, kind of something in between. So which doesn't mean traveling long distances to nice beaches, and also doesn't mean to be sitting in front of a computer only. And the path we were taking at the time was this multi-hub semi-virtual conference. So there the idea is to have an event which takes place in several cities at the same time. And in this particular event, we had hubs in La Plata, Argentina, Montreal, Canada, Graz, Austria, and Sydney, Australia. And we had a program that ran simultaneously everywhere. And I'm going to explain a little bit how this can work. So here you see an example from a short excerpt of the program from the first day of the conference. So the time on the left is in UTC, that's coordinated world time, so no particular time zone, but this kind of general format. And then you could look here at a particular time slot at the conference and see that, okay, at that time, so 2:30 UTC, there was an event in something going on in Graz in 3 different rooms, and then something in Montreal in 2 different rooms, and then something in Argentina. And the way that each of those would have looked was that if we take one as example, there would be a real audience there, and then there'd be a virtual audience from the different hub where there was a connection between those 2 rooms. And then additionally, when you're streaming everything anyways, you can include some fully virtual participants too. So if you have a multi-hub conference like this, you can easily also include fully virtual participants that are at home, as I think we've also heard in the previous talk. That could be a nice option. But still, the emphasis should be on having audiences connected worldwide and people going somewhere and having an event there. And if you really want this program to be rich, then you want to make sure that you have overlap between what's happening at the hubs so that you could actually communicate between them. And this was a rough table of the program we had. So there were sometimes like here where there were 3 hubs active at the same time. So where this shows the time in UTC and this shows the local time, and then we could have plenty of interaction. And with this particular selection of hubs, we couldn't always guarantee that there was overlap. So there was some time in Sydney where they were alone on the program. So that means that at that time they either had local talks or were showing recordings of previous talks, and we had a system which allowed them to still answer questions and ask questions and get the answers later. So these were really practical challenges we had to solve and do that. And I can also tell you, as being in charge of the technology there, that 24 program can be quite stressful because someone might call you at any time during the day or night. Okay, but what's really important is that if you have this global program, then timekeeping needs to be very rigorous. So what we had was a dedicated website which showed the time in UTC and then the local time, and that would be shown at all the hubs, so the chairs were able to exactly start and end sessions on time. And also this little website there played some music during breaks so that you really knew, okay, your time is over. So these are the things I just mentioned: 24-hour time schedule, then paper sessions, demos, workshops were all done real live plus virtual, and then plus recorded sessions, especially if some hubs were not online all the time, or also just to fill the program at particular times. And there were fully remote participants. On top of that, we had some symposia where within one session, real and virtual talks would be alternating, so that you could have one in one hub and the next talk in the other hub. We had a keynote at each hub, and the live streams and recordings were also made available to all participants at all times, so that you could watch them also from elsewhere. And for technology, this was actually quite, we tried to keep this quite simple so that you wouldn't need a lot of specialized equipment and a lot of very particular expertise. So for the live interaction, we're using Zoom. Mind you, this was in 2018, and at least in Europe, Zoom was not as popular yet, but we figured that it worked really well at the time. And then YouTube to stream things, and then the Moodle platform, which is this open platform to share the links. In the breaks, we had what we called the global foyer. So that was basically a chat room with some little walls there, acoustic material that would create these little booths where you could just walk up to one of them, and then there'd be a connection to another hub, and you could say hi to someone somewhere else on the planet during your coffee break. So we did a little bit of evaluation of this following the conference. So I'm just going to show you the main results here. So that we asked people about their overall opinion in one of the questions, and this was kind of the distribution. So the mean was a little bit above average, and you see that there's one a group. If you take number 5 to be people that are undecided, there's about 60% in those that have a positive tendency, and 40 in the low one. But what's really interesting is if we divide this up by hubs. So here's the one for Graz, which was the biggest hub. Here's the one from Montreal. So while this one is kind of this more opinionated bimodal distribution, you see something that looks much more normal here. Sydney, not so many people attended, and even fewer answered the questionnaire, but this is the one I was the most happy about. So the hub in La Plata, people were very much in favor of the format. And also we asked during the closing ceremony, we asked people to, you can imagine all the hubs connected virtually, and we asked people to raise their hand if they had not attended the conference had it been a regular event in Graz. And almost everybody in La Plata raised their hand. So this really showed that we were able to include researchers in this conference that otherwise wouldn't have been included. So, okay, to summarize these, so we also got more participation in general. As I said, about 60% rather in favor of the format. And then we had calculated by the Wegener Center for Climate Change in Graz that we achieved roughly 70% of emission cuts related to a normal conference. Okay, so, and we hope that this is some kind of compromise. You have medium level of face-to-face interaction, you have medium level of emissions, and then high inclusivity. Okay, so to summarize, conventional conferences have high environmental costs. As we try to reduce those to zero, we need a trade-off between a functioning academia and climate catastrophe. And we need to consider the needs of researchers in different stages of their career when we're having this discussion. Multi-hub events, we believe, can provide one compromise, still offering some real social interaction and a feeling of going to an event while kind of cutting the total amount of kilometers traveled. And then, yeah, if you want a good program, then it's really crucial to select the hubs well. But this is something, kind of hub optimization that we've heard about before, and maybe we can discuss in the previous presentation, and maybe we can discuss later also. Okay, thanks. I should acknowledge everybody who was part of this at the time. And here you can also watch a video documentary or read the paper. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Nils. Our final presentation is by Dr. Cassandra Raby.
Hi everyone. So moving away from thinking about the hub option, I'm going to be talking about what happens when we move conferences entirely online. And I'll be talking about the format that we use in order to do that, and also what the environmental consequences were when we did that. So to introduce myself, I'm a teaching fellow at the University of Leeds, and I'm also a conservation biologist. So I don't usually work in conferencing. However, when it came to the COVID pandemic and the restrictions that came in place, my fieldwork was cancelled. And somehow in that gap of time, I ended up developing a website for online conferences that was going to be used for quite a few different events. And this was in collaboration with the Association for the Study of Animal Behavior, or ASAB, who were happening to want to move their conferences online, and that was a big part of what they wanted to do. This was in collaboration with Dr. Joe Madden at the University of Exeter. For a little bit of background, ASAB usually have 3 conferences a year. One of them is free ticket delegates, and the other ones are quite low cost. And in 2019, they were starting to get a little bit concerned about the sustainability of all these meetings they were having. And they wanted to think about a platform that could be reused frequently, so they could use it at multiple events, but would also be low cost. They hadn't necessarily planned on doing this straight away. It was just starting to be in the conversation. And then COVID came along, and suddenly it made this transition a priority to them. And it initiated this development of a conference platform. So what I'll talk about in this session, I'll introduce what that conference platform looked like. I'll then illustrate the environmental impact of that first meeting we had when we moved the conference online. And then I'll very briefly touch on some of the future directions and next steps. So thinking about the website, I don't expect you to look at all the detail on this image here, but in one of the papers, I do lay out how we created the website in order to manage the conference. One of the sections, one of the boxes shows that there's web pages which are accessible to everyone. And then we've got these secured web pages on the right-hand side. And we try to replicate an awful lot of what you would see in a normal in-person conference. So the talks, the posters, the meetings, the workshops, and the social events as well. So I outline in the paper some of the technology we use. But unsurprisingly, if you want to have it engaging, if you want to replicate some of the things that happen at real in-person conferences, you're going to require a little bit of imagination. And so these are some of the different ways that we manage to replicate these in-person conferences. So this is a meeting room where people could meet virtually and talk to each other. It's an entirely free platform, so it didn't cost us anything to use this. We could put adverts around, and what you saw at the beginning were people having pictures of themselves up. So that's one way that we have networking events. And then this is our virtual poster room. So again, it was completely free to build this. This wasn't using any special technology, but it kind of allowed for that little bit of engagement. People could look at the posters they wanted to choose. And then the information about the presenter would be there, and we'd have a Zoom link as well, so they could drop in and talk to the presenter and ask any questions. So there was quite a lot of different ways that we tried to create this quite cheaply and make it still quite an engaging event. And so the overall cost of this was really very low. And so one of the key things about this format to note, so we designed it to replicate in-person conferences. We had much of the same events going on. The platform was really low cost, and this meant that ASAB could offer the first event for free for delegates. And then for the second, well, the next few events that we did from this, they charged £15, or if participants couldn't pay that, it was entirely free. The development of the platform was quite quick, so we managed to have the first conference in July 2020, which was really nice because there was a lot of enthusiasm for online conferences. And this platform has been used at multiple conferences. In the end, we ended up helping to create 10 conferences, I think, using this website. So we really got a good idea of what worked and what didn't work. So it was a really nice way of moving everything online. And these pictures are just some examples of some of the conferences that it was used at. So that was a bit of a quick tour of what the actual website is like. But thinking about what the consequences are of moving these conferences online, I'll start to illustrate the environmental impact of what happened with these events. So, as I said before, just by chance, ASAB had thought, okay, we want to know how sustainable our events are. And fortunately, in 2019, Joe Madden had started collecting data from the people that attended their in-person conference. And he asked them where everyone has traveled from to try and get an idea of the carbon footprint of the event. And that worked perfectly because the next year, he had no idea this was happening, but the next year we were moving everything online. And so then we used the data from the website and the website analytics to look at where people had visited from for the online conference that happened the following year. And then we asked two questions with this. How much lower is the carbon footprint of the online event compared to the in-person event? And if everyone that attended the online event visited London for the in-person event, how high would the carbon footprint be? So as you saw in the opening meeting, we had a really similar impact of the moving online as NIH has had as well. So we had 950 people register, so not quite as high numbers, but comparatively high for ASAB. On the day, we only had about half of the people actually attend and use the website, but it's still quite high numbers in comparison. And we detail this in the paper linked here. In comparison, in 2019, for the in-person event, there was 172 delegates. So you can see that number increased quite a bit as soon as we moved online. For the 102 delegates, most of those were in the UK. There were some from the EU as well, so not traveling quite so far. And only a really small percentage were international. So we were quite generous about what might happen in terms of travel. We assumed that most people that were based in London had no carbon footprint in order to get to the event. We looked at how people traveled to the event in London, and so 102 by train, 7 were by bus or coach or car, and 43 were by plane. And we managed to calculate as a rough estimate that there was 19.11 tons of carbon dioxide released during that travel. In comparison to our online event, we did carbon footprint estimates based on the use of technology. So we assumed that everyone that had attended the conference on the day spent the whole day on their computers using all the software that we developed. And our estimate was, as a high estimate, that there's 1.2 tons of carbon as the carbon footprint. So the online version was 17 times lower of their carbon footprint compared to the in-person event. And that's even with the online version having so many more people participate. So what would happen if those over 400 people had decided to come to the event in London instead? What kind of carbon footprint would we be looking at? So we managed to get 417 locations from the people that attended the online conference. You can see that it was a lot more international in terms of the event. And so only 45% came from the UK. Otherwise, people were traveling from overseas. And so we assumed that everyone was traveling from the capital city of the country they were traveling from to London, and they took a flight. And so we're really cutting out, again, this is a really low estimate because people have got to travel to the airports, and it's not including the actual event itself. But if we're just basing it on those flights alone, it would have been a huge distance traveled, and it would be 234.7 tons of carbon dioxide. So a huge impact. We gave out a survey prior and after the online conference asking for people's opinions. Again, these feature in the papers, so don't worry about the details so much, but we asked people whether they were concerned about the impact of the carbon footprint of in-person conferences. And if you look at the top of this graph, most of it is green. Green means yes. And so yes, most people are. That's 78%. We also asked whether online conferences were more attractive because they reduce carbon dioxide, or the carbon footprint, and most people agreed, that's over 90% of people agreed that that is what makes online conferences really attractive. However, some individuals found that online conferences are less attractive because of the lack of travel. We saw in the previous talk some of the benefits of traveling to different locations, and you can see how some of the locations look quite enticing to travel to. So that does have an impact on people's enthusiasm for these online events. We also asked for people's opinions. I won't go through each of these. However, I wanted to just show that we got a range of feedback around people's thoughts about how we should be interacting and how we should be using conferences. And because we work in the kind of conservation and animal behavior sector, a lot of people felt like we should be leading the way and making sure that our conferences are as low carbon footprint as possible, because that is a key part of why we're meeting. It seems ironic to be traveling in person to then talk about the impact of climate change on species. So that's been a really brief overview of some of our findings, but hopefully it illustrates the impact of moving conferences online. And so I'll just very briefly touch on future directions and next steps. So now that the kind of changes in COVID restrictions have gone, is there still an interest in online conferences? So this is based on a paper we just had published last month. And we noticed that, yes, people still want to attend online conferences. And I think that's summarized pretty well in us all attending this conference here and how useful that's been for connecting people internationally. And we found the same thing for a recent conference. We had lower participation in countries where people had the finances to travel, but higher participation elsewhere. And these data are being presented in one of the posters tomorrow, so do make sure to check that out. So in summary, online conferences have a lower carbon footprint than in-person events, and that's 17 times lower. Online conferences are more inclusive and have a greater reach, so more international delegates can attend. We had 417 different locations reported compared to our 3 different locations before. An online version of the conference, if moved in person, would have a really high carbon footprint. So we wouldn't be able to replicate the impact that we saw of this online conference to an in-person version. So that just goes to show some of the nice benefits. So thank you everyone for listening, and I look forward to chatting to you all.
And thank you to all 3 of our speakers for your excellent presentations. We will now move into the moderated discussion. As a reminder to our audience, you may use the Q&A function to submit your questions for speakers. Your submitted questions will be visible to the moderators and speakers, but not to the rest of the audience. I'd like to begin with some clarification questions and questions for specific speakers that came in during the Q&A. So our first question, I think this actually applies to both Yanqiu and to Nils. Are the multiple hubs active simultaneously? Having multiple hubs seems quite difficult to manage and coordinate. Can you speak to the downsides of having multiple hubs?
Yeah, so should I start from our practical perspective? Yes, it's complicated. It's certainly more complicated than organizing an ordinary conference. But I think that it's not impossible, and it just requires some careful thinking, like coordinating a conference always does. And I think that by now the technology is really not that difficult to use. So yeah, I can also refer to our paper where we offer some guidelines about how to organize this and some particular challenges, how to solve them.
Yeah, so in terms, so as my research is focusing on the environmental impacts of the like virtual and hybrid conferences. So I'll answer the question from this side. So I would say that whether the hubs active simultaneously or not doesn't like have an impact on their like climate or like environmental impacts, because like when we like calculate the environmental impacts for the conferences, like the simultaneousness doesn't do anything with like the environments. And also like having like the downsides of having multiple hubs. So as I just introduced for the like the hybrid, the environmental impacts of the hybrid conferences. So if you do not like, if the conference organizer do not choose like an effective strategy to organize their multi-hub hybrid conference, then there may cause some like issue in like even like increasing or not reducing the environmental impacts a lot. So yeah, I think that's my answer.
Thank you, Yanqiu. All right, Nils, I have a question for you. You presented that you had these global foyers to discuss between hubs. I'm wondering what the attendance rate was and what feedback you received from those that used this opportunity.
Yeah, so definitely this was one of the less successful parts. So maybe we had quite a naive idea about it, that you would just walk up and kind of talk to someone random on the other end. It was used during the first day, kind of to check it out, but then quickly the enthusiasm about this was over. So that's definitely something that we should rethink. We did also have the opportunity to have scheduled meetings with someone. So if there's someone that you, I don't know, maybe usually talk to at a conference or want to talk to, we were trying to have a meeting room available that at each hub that you could schedule, like you could book a time slot and have that during the event. Also, this was not used very much, I guess, because you could have a normal Zoom meeting and wouldn't need to do that at the event. What we did consider changing about it is to have this a little bit more structured, that you would go to this place with a whole group of people at a given time slot, rather than just during the coffee break where people are busy talking to each other at the real site. And in fact, we did this kind of more structured global foyer in one later event where I think people used it much more. So yeah, but this is definitely one of the more challenging parts and to do.
Thank you. All right, this next question is for Cassandra. We are currently also thinking about organizing a virtual conference by using already established free tools. My question is, we are required to prioritize compliance with the General Data Protection Regulation when choosing tools. Did you also experience a challenge in that and consider it?
Yes, for sure. It has to be a priority when you're thinking about using people's data and complying with that. So for us, we made sure that people knew how their data were going to be used. And we also made sure that at the end of the conference, once we kind of finished sharing these kind of long-term videos, that all data were going to be deleted. And that's generally the best way around it, is making sure that you've got clarity in terms of how the data is going to be used, what's going to happen to it, and then making sure you follow through and remove data at the end of the conference once the whole thing's finished. We kept videos up for a few months, and then we started removing the data.
Okay, thank you. This next question is both for Yanqiu and for Nils. How do we get people to drive 500 kilometers by car? In the US and surely elsewhere in the world, it might not be allowed to use a car to travel to attend a professional meeting because of the cost. And I think this is in reference to actually being able to make it to the hubs physically for these meetings.
Yeah, actually, so for my study, unlike the other two speakers, which they like actually did the virtual conference like trial, but my study is based on like a real conference, but I use the setting of the real conference to do like a simulation. So so the 500 kilometer is like it's a setting I use to determine like whether people should drive or like take a plane or so. So I think in yes, for some cases, like people are not allowed to drive the car to the conference venue, but I think in other cases, such as it doesn't have to be a professional like meeting. It can be a business trip or like it can be like sometimes you just don't have any like public transportation mode to get to your like destination. Like I'm in the Isaka and it's like a very upstate New York. And if we want to go to some place like Buffalo or like Syracuse, there's no other ways than driving or like take a bus. So sometimes you just have to drive. So that's why I use a setting like this, because driving is more frequent and acceptable in the US.
Niels, is there anything that you would like to add?
Yeah, I could add that for our format, it was we didn't force people to take the car, right? So you could fly to your nearest hub. So then at least there's a reduction of the kilometers traveled. It's a kind of not an intercontinental flight anymore then. So I think that was up to everyone. We did try to encourage people to take the train, which in Europe is quite easy to do between most capital cities. But even there, for some places it's quite difficult. So now I live in Finland, so that taking surface transport always involves taking a ferry ride now also currently. So it's but it was up to everyone to decide that.
Okay, thank you. And Cassandra, I have one question for you. My question concerns professional association finances. The associations with which I'm familiar depend heavily on the financial gain from the annual association to keep themselves afloat. Is this not the common situation for scholarly associations? If it is common, how do we solve it?
It's a good question. I think a lot of the associations I've worked with, they don't necessarily rely on the funding from conferences. They rely on the membership fees, and a lot of them also have journals that they manage to get finances from when people pay to publish their research. So for the most part, the conferences themselves are just something that they don't want to lose much money from, or they could gain a little bit. But for the most part, it's not so much of a moneymaker, especially when it comes to biological sciences in terms of conservation. You don't necessarily get organizations willing to give large levels of sponsorship. So for the groups that I worked for, they just didn't want to lose too much money. I mean, regardless, even if people were wanting to ask people to pay to attend the event, they would still generally make a bit of money, because the way that we developed the website was the overall running costs would be, let's say, 300 for the website, 300 for Zoom, and then maybe an extra 100 for bits and pieces here and there. You know, we're talking about such a low level of money that it was just so easy to not be concerned about losing anything. But yeah, I think for groups that maybe make money from conferences, it's a slightly different situation, but it's not quite so common in, at least with the groups I was working with.
Thank you. And because we're running a little low on time, I did want to get into at least one general question for all three of our panelists here. So the biggest environmental impact of scientific conferences and meetings is the travel required to attend these meetings in person. Aside from travel, what are some other sustainability considerations for conferences and meetings, whether they are virtual, hybrid, or in person? And so I did want to add one question on to that question. Have any of you thought about looking at the environmental impact of the hotel stays that are associated with these in-person meetings? And the floor is yours.
I mean, I can start off with a really simple answer of no, we only looked at travel because it was just the easiest way of summarizing that massive change. But there is a lot to consider if you're thinking about the location, you're thinking about the food, you're thinking about hotels, the electronics required is going to be quite different in person compared to online. So I can't add much to this other than say it's a good question.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would say that we did look at the hotel, the hotel stay or like the food, and like basically every stage involved in like the conference preparation, operation, and like the end. So yeah, I think it's maybe our time doesn't allow me to get into like the details, but you can, if you are interested, you can check my paper on like Nature Communications, and the paper title will be the same as my presentation title, and yeah, and also there's a question asking for the like the virtual, like the network connection, impact, like the environmental impacts. So I would say like we also consider that, but that doesn't contribute like very significantly to the final like carbon footprint.
Yeah, I could say that we did implement a couple of other measures at the time. Some were more successful and popular than others. So what was easy to do was to carefully select the things that you give as gifts to participants. You know, often you give a bag of something and a mug. So I think we selected that a bit rather carefully. And then we tried to reduce paper by not printing a thick book of abstract, which I think was still quite common in that field. And by far, I would say the least popular measure we took, at least from what I gathered while I was at the event. Oh no, my connection. You can hear me. The least popular was that we offered vegan food. And some people were really not happy with that, but that was kind of something we wanted to do to make a point. And to me, actually, I quite liked it, but it's a matter of taste. And the last thing I could maybe add to this was the one other thing that was in the budget was offsetting emissions through supporting projects that do carbon offsetting, and this was in the budget for the conference, and part of the conference was funded, or there was support by the federal state of Styria in Austria, which is part of Austria, and they they accepted the funding, the proposal for how that money would be spent, which included the carbon offsetting. But in the end, they decided not to pay for it when it came to actually paying back the money. So I hope I got this right now, but that was also something we tried.
Wonderful. Well, we're approaching 3:42, so we're going to go ahead and wrap up this session. But first, I would like to thank all of our speakers for an excellent panel session and discussion, and to thank every one of you in the audience for submitting engaging questions and for participating in this conversation. This concludes our panel session on redefining conferences, innovative formats for sustainable engagement. Please join us at 4 p.m. Eastern Time for our next session, which is a plenary presentation by Dr. Lucy Gilson, Dean of the Peter T. Paul College of Business and Economics, University of New Hampshire. Thank you all again for joining us, and this concludes our session.